All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Justice and Peace's guest speaker series here. And today's guest is Lisa Cabel, who is an experienced management side employment, labor, and human rights lawyer. Her practice focuses on matters relating to employee relations. She has a diverse array of clients from all industries, startups, family businesses, and large cap public or private sector employees and companies. She provides her clients with advice on a broad range of employment, labor relation, and human rights issues, such as collective agreements, collective bargaining, employee discipline and termination, wrongful dismissal claims, health and safety issues, harassment, workplace policies. I mean, you name it, day-to-day legal advice. And certainly now in COVID times, probably a lot of things coming on your table. So thank you so much, Lisa, here for joining us here today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Lisa, certainly maybe you can start by telling us a little bit more kind of how you got to being the national leader and starting the group here, KPMG Law here in Canada. And certainly you've had a wealth of experience leading up to it. So please share with my students how you got here and what got you into law in the first place.
Sure. I think it actually, before I went to law school, I think I was sort of inspired to get into law, partly from my mom, who for about 18 years was a paralegal, working in a small real estate firm and wills and estates firm in Mississauga. And then she sort of left and became a teacher of law clerks for the time the Toronto School of Business. And so I sort of saw what she was doing. And then near the end of high school and undergrad, I started working within law firms just as an admin assistant to get a sense of what it was like. And, it looked like something that, I wanted to do and wanted to practice as a lawyer. So when I went to law school, I wasn't entirely convinced when I went into law school what area of practice I wanted to work in. So when I was interviewing and looking for summer positions, I was really focused on getting kind of a full service firm and being able to rotate and get that sort of capture experience in like corporate litigation. But throughout the course of law school, I participated in moot competitions and took various courses. And I really took to a liking of labor and employment fairly early on at law school. I think it was what drew me it was just interesting stories. Like there's crazy things that people do, and then they get litigated. So I liked the labor part of it, like working with unions, having negotiating collective agreements. And then when I started getting into practice, I went to Stikeman Elliott as a summer articling student and an associate, and it was very heavy transaction work that I was doing. So I was in labor and employment, but I wasn't quite doing the labor side of the practice that I wanted. So I moved to BLG, and I was there for a long time, about 10 years, was a partner there and had a great wealth of experience, was on my feet a lot. The great thing about this particular practice is you do get a lot of opportunities to get on your feet. And I would say that for young lawyers as well as clerks, I think especially on the union side, if you're sort of a rep working with a union, not all of them are lawyers. So even appearing in arbitrations and doing litigation, some of them come from like a paralegal clerk background. So I always found that very interesting. So I might be on the other side of the table to somebody who comes from a different path than I did. So then I moved to Norton Rose with a new opportunity and had great successful practice there with a really good group of people. And then KPMG kind of came knocking and said, hey, we have a law firm. We have corporate, we've got tax, we've got immigration, and we want employment. So it was an opportunity that I felt I could, sort of start the move, not entirely out of the practice of law, but more into the business of law and working at building a team, building up a practice, and connecting in a different way within the firm. So I work with accountants, I work with consultants, I work with the audit practice, and we go to clients together as a kind of one-stop shop. The nice thing about employment law is every company has employees. So you're always going to need to talk to somebody, whether it be an HR professional or a labor and employment counsel or advisor. Is going to be needed as you manage employees. And like you said, JP, like we've had quite a year. for managing employees and dealing with employment issues. So hopefully that helps, just as my background.
Perfect. And let's start right there with sort of the hot button topic, obviously, over the last year with COVID-19, and it's probably just changed the game, so to speak, with the employment law and employment related issues. And I think recently, I think on KPMG's podcast, you were talking about the challenges and the successes there of working from home or working anywhere, really. How does that kind of, I mean, let's start maybe with kind of a broad overview now, but we were just talking before starting here that, I mean, do I need to be going into the office for a lot of jobs? I mean, can they force me back now that I got the first dose and the second one's coming hopefully in the next few months? But what does this mean in terms of what the future holds for working anywhere or going back to business as usual?
Yeah, and I think there's, I'll give you my lawyer answer of it depends. And it really does depend on the industry that you're in. So you have, I would kind of break it down into 3 buckets of where companies are grappling with these issues. And I think they have been since the beginning. So you sort of have the one spectrum of companies who are, have to, they're essential services, they're people who are coming into the plant or coming into the facility, whether it be a hospital or long-term care, and they have to manage health and safety from that perspective and their employees physically being there. And so they're managing it in a very different way than sort of the type of, I would say, middle ground company where, they are able to stay open and active, but everybody had to go home. Everybody had to leave the office and can work from home, but still continue to operate the business. And then you sort of have the other last spectrum, which is people who, like you think of restaurants, who just had to shut down, lay off their employees, the retail sector, and really had to lean on more of the government subsidy, like the CEWS program or the SERV, and really help people out from that perspective. And so I think that the industry has impacted how, from the beginning, the employers have faced issues and will continue to shape the way we move forward. I think that absolutely, if there's a requirement to be physically in the workspace, then I can tell you we recently did a survey, and I think over 70% of the people surveyed said that they would expect those that are around them in the workplace to be vaccinated. So it's kind of interesting because then I've got employers asking me all the time, well, can we mandate it? Like, what's the question there? Am I capable of, asking people, can I from a privacy perspective, or can I from just an employment law perspective? And the answer is, well, again, it depends. Like, if you have an industry where you're potentially, there's a risk to somebody that you are either taking care of or you're in contact with in the course of your employment, then you might be able, the employer may be able to justify that this is a reasonable requirement for the job. So we are asking you to be vaccinated. We know the effectiveness is really high. This is not like the flu vaccine where it was a bit of a different test. So there may be a requirement for some industries where mandating vaccines is possible. Then you've got the other side of it where it's like, well, I've been productive working from home for 14 months, or I think I have been. And many companies say they have, but now we're looking at, well, can they force you back to work? If once people that we're opening it up and we're able to, sort of have more interaction. And I think that's, again, a bit of I think they can. I don't think employees necessarily have the right to say, I have been working from home, I want to continue to. But I do think that their preference to stay at home will likely be, listened by employers, because otherwise they'll leave. Like, I think people will make the choice if they can work from home, and they may, look for other options or leave their organization. So I hope that kind of answers some of the questions there. I think, yeah, absolutely. You can ask people to come back to the workplace because that's the initial contract, right? The requirements to be in a certain location. And, but if you force them, I think you risk losing them.
Yeah, I mean, I think with law, I mean, everything pretty much depends on the situations there. And,
Yeah.
but I think what has certainly come to the table is if we've been able to be effective outside of the office, then perhaps you can even look at it from an accommodations perspective of, well, look, I can take care of my kids, the costs there, family on family ground or it might be something that can. I mean, obviously, it's too early to tell until we're at the point where we're getting the ability to really go back to see how everything kind of unfolds. But it certainly raises a lot of interesting things in labor and employment law because, I mean, I think, if you look to 2 years ago, if someone wanting to work from home, most places would say like, there's no chance that that's going to happen because how do we know you're going to be productive, right?
That's right. Yeah, no, I agree. And I think you're right. From a human rights perspective, there are circumstances where people sort of trigger the code and there may be a requirement to accommodate. The other thing is, I would say that, if people are afraid to come into the office because they have to commute, right? And for genuinely, a lot of people are really, fearful to be exposed again and to sort of go out in the world. So how do you deal with that? Like, is that considered a mental health issue that we're accommodating, right? And so or maybe as the world opens up and there's more people commuting and you already have been, but now there's more people, that could trigger something. So maybe the employer's response could be, okay, we're going to shift your schedule. So you're not going to be coming in on busy commute times because you have to do your job here. We can't have you do it remotely and stuff. So I think, was it Bryce? I can't wait to work from home. And that's the other thing is that I think a real request for what is being called the hybrid work environment. So you have perhaps a couple of days of at home and a couple of days in the office. I think the fear for many employers there is they don't want people just sort of saying, okay, fine, Monday, Friday, I'm not going to be in the office. And then it's just really extended long weekends. Perhaps. So for the skeptical group, I think they might look at it that way. On the other hand, having certain days where everybody's in the office, I think is really helpful because then you're encouraging that collaboration and creativity that many employers have said they've missed since everybody's been at home. So.
And I guess the other thing there that comes up certainly is privacy and security, right? In terms of, let's say they give you a work computer and you're using your private network at home, and it makes things with malware and phishing and all sorts of attacks. Like, I mean, is there anything that can be done to prevent that from happening, or is there a risk? And certainly for the employees, if you are working from home, that you have to be following all protocols and things like that.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that the way employers ideally would look at it is you're in the same work environment at home as you would be in the office. So even from an equipment perspective and safety, like ergonomically, do you have the right chairs? Do you have the right setup? Do you have the right tools in your workspace? If we're asking people to work from home, and then also, do you have the right cybersecurity protection around your systems? And from the employee's perspective, there should be an obligation that you're going to continue. You work through a VPN. You make sure you're not doing printing to a personal printer. I know that has come up from time to time because you could be in breach of your policy if you're doing that. So there is the risk. I think the added risk of the cybersecurity, which I've seen a lot of clients pay more attention to because we had to, right? Like, I think that was early on an issue that people flagged with everybody just working from home. And then you have the situation of just, working from anywhere. I think you use that terminology. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean I'm in the Starbucks using their Wi-Fi? So there might be limits on the ability to work there, but then also in other countries. And we've seen a decent amount of traction in my practice about that as well, where companies are saying, you know what, our employees might want to, now that hopefully the borders open up, we're going to finally use that vacation budget we've been saving for the past year, and we want to go and live in Spain for 4 weeks, but I can't take that much vacation, so can I go and stay and rent a house and work from there? And so there are tax implications, there are immigration issues, there are employment law considerations. So we've been working with clients collectively amongst all of the subject matter experts to help them navigate those scenarios to allow employees to work from like places like Italy and Spain, or various places in the US, that kind of thing. That's come up quite a bit.
Well, that's really interesting because, again, I remember Barbados had this whole 1 year come and work here and live the life. But I mean, I guess as you brought it up, can you, like, at what point, if you go on a vacation and you're answering emails and corresponding and working, maybe during that, some people don't ever really get that 1 week off that they want. But I mean, at what point, if you're there, then does it? I mean, are you now working in Barbados? Or are you still working in Canada? I mean, do you have any kind of insight there on that?
That's an interesting question, because I think that at any point, and you think of even the business traveler as somebody who's like traveling around the world, just temporarily going places, or if they're on vacation and you said they're working, they're logging in and doing that. I think that has always taken with it a risk that you're potentially establishing an employment relationship in that country. Somewhat depends on the country, and from a tax perspective, there's always days attached to it. Employment law, it doesn't work the same way. Like, as soon as you start working in that country, you are at risk of those local laws applying. So one thing, though, that from a Canadian perspective is helpful is that most of our regulations, most of our laws supersede what is going on around the world. So our minimum hours of work, our minimum wage, our requirements around overtime, those things are typically, over and above what another country would require. So there's very little risk from a Canadian perspective if somebody is working, regardless of vacation or not. So, but there are absolutely, like, technically, whether or not practically it turns into anything, those local laws would apply.
And the other thing I think that certainly comes up in terms of monitoring, right now, even at work, you'd have maybe sometimes they'd have cameras or keystroke monitoring. And now I guess you have all of these programs that people are collaborating on, maybe Zoom, Microsoft Teams in particular, where they can see, my students probably don't know this, but I can see how many times they've logged in and how long they've been into certain things. So I'd imagine the same thing's available to management at different places. So how does that all work in terms of what can be done, and at what point does it kind of become more of an intrusion than anything?
Yeah, well, I think the intrusion's the key word there, right? Like, I think and the other word is, the words are expectation of privacy. So if an employer, is providing you with a laptop, like they would be at work, in the workplace or at home, or they're providing you with a device, I think that reasonably, typically, you shouldn't have an expectation of privacy around that device. If their policies clearly state that you can use it for personal reasons, then you start to have an expectation of privacy to a point around your use of those devices. In terms of monitoring, there's usually the employer has the right to be able to sort of, like you said, like you can flag certain things or log certain things. But again, it's all within a reasonable's standard. So these tools exist. They always have. They have for many years existed, or even surveillance cameras in the warehouse kind of thing. But I think ideally, if at least it's set out in a policy, is typically how the law would look at it. Like, what does the policy say, and how do you establish that expectation of privacy? Because that's your source document for that, right?
Perfect. So, as well with COVID, there's been a bunch of new laws coming, and things being suspended and things like that. One of the most recent developments, of course, was some, depending on where you are, too little, too much in terms of paid sick leave and how that all applies. So maybe you can kind of give a little bit of a quick overview there for students who are wondering, what does this mean? Like, can I take some time off, and how does it all work?
Sure. So if your employer doesn't have paid COVID days, it's a mix. Like, I have some clients that do, have a good amount of paid days where somebody had symptoms or was sick or was dealing with COVID. It sort of helped transition them during that period of time. If they don't, then, or you're taking some time off to get the vaccine, or, you have symptoms associated with the vaccine, you need to take some time off work. So basically, the provincial government, and this was a bit of a debate in the budget. I think the provinces were hoping the federal government would help out in covering some of that, and the feds essentially said, no, that's a provincial issue. And so Ontario kind of responded saying you can have a few days paid, or they'll reimburse the employer of up to, I think it's $600 a day. Don't quote me on that. I haven't looked at legislation the last couple of days, but if you to take that, you can get the subsidy. So there's coverage. So the employee gets paid. They're not at a loss. Because I think a real problem has been that people maybe who can't afford not to work may be coming in sick or are ignoring symptoms that are there, and I had seen this in my practice, maybe lying about getting a test and waiting for results and then coming into work. So even though there's a pre-screening questionnaire asking all these things, they're saying no, 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 and going in and working. And then turns out, 24 hours later, they tested positive, which requires the plant to shut down or the office to close, or and then there's some bigger issues. And so it's unfortunate in those circumstances if people are doing that because they don't have the ability to lose, because they can't lose a day's pay. So I think that's really the incentive for the government to react and allow people some coverage for this time, as well as the getting the vaccine.
Now, I mean, you brought that up, but what happens if, let's say, a place doesn't have proper protocols, or people just ignore or just show up, and then somebody else contracts, and you have this whole sort of, how it can spread easily. I mean, maybe hopefully we're not kind of at that point anymore, but even with a one shot there, it doesn't necessarily mean you have complete immunity. And even going forward, I mean, it's not like forever that you'd have to still get the boosters and things like that. But is a company going to be responsible if you contract COVID at work? Is that kind of like an occupational health and safety kind of issue if they don't kind of have physical distancing, things like that? And what have you heard?
I think so. This has been debated quite a bit in terms of, are we going to be able to say COVID, is there like a WSIB claim? Like, can we get coverage if you lose time? Is it lost time under the Act? And I'm not aware of, originally there, early on, like last May, I think it was, there was a private member's bill that tabled the idea of contracting COVID at work to a potential workplace injury under the Act, which would allow for a WSIB claim. That didn't go anywhere. And so there doesn't seem to be any traction at, sort of saying that this is a workplace injury. That being said, there's still an obligation of employers to do everything that's reasonably necessary to protect their workers. And so up to now, that's really been limited to screening people, right? Like, you screen at the door, you've got temperature checks, you've got, making sure people are wearing masks, you have mask policies, you have hand sanitizer available, you're doing regular cleaning, you're asking people coming into the door if they've traveled, there's a typical set of questions, or you kind of defer to the provincial set of questions. The latest thing I think is very interesting is the rapid testing in the workplace. And so we've seen the government has released sort of a protocol around rapid testing, and they've started to connect some employers with rapid testing. Now, there's getting a positive result from one of the rapid antigen tests, they call them RADs. It doesn't necessarily mean COVID, but it's, obviously persuasive for, the people involved to make sure the person goes and gets a COVID test, and perhaps more so than what would be the typical questionnaire. And so to answer, sort of layering in that to your question, like, is that potentially the expectation? Like, you need to have the testing available for it to be part of that reasonable screening. But then on the flip side, I think there's a lot of people are going to say, well, I don't want to be tested, like, and under what circumstances? And who's doing the testing? Apparently, some of these tests can be administered, they can be self-administered. So you don't have to necessarily, you can do it yourself in the supervision of somebody who's been trained to do it. And I think typically the test results are not kept, because you don't really want to keep those health records of people. And perhaps my other sort of comment on the rapid testing might be, maybe you don't do it unless something else has come up in your other screening. Like if you had, maybe they answered yes to a question that maybe otherwise they would have answered no, or you see symptoms, or maybe their temperature is a bit high. So that might then cause you to go and do the test itself.
And then I guess that leads into what we were talking about before with respect to like vaccines. And then if that has to be compulsory, because maybe if you don't mandate that, then have you gone to kind of a reasonable expectation of kind of taking care of the workers, and especially with anyone that has face-to-face interaction with the general public? Because I mean, it's one thing to have control over your employees. It's another to have over just anyone coming into the work environment. What are you going to mandate if it's at like a Walmart or something? Like, how are you going to have to show like a vaccine passport or something to get in, or because we insist on all of these things? I mean, it's a lot of things that come up.
A lot, I agree. And I think that the reality is that hopefully it's not being left up to employers. Because, really, I think that something like that where we would really want the government to step in and mandate the vaccine. It should, ideally it would come from a public authority as opposed to a private employer forcing the employees to do it, right? Because then that's a harder decision to make. It goes back to that sort of test that I talked about earlier, if you're in a safety sensitive position. So it would be much easier if the government mandated it, and then we could say, okay, like, kids going to school. So with the exception of few things like disability or religion, under the Human Rights Code, kids have to be vaccinated to go to school. So I don't know if this will go in that direction or not, but it would certainly make the decisions for policies that employers have a lot easier.
Certainly, there's been quite the change there for you. I mean, starting the practice there at KMP and GLO. What else have you seen besides kind of what we were talking about in terms of other big issues surrounding the pandemic and the change in employment and labor law? What else have you seen over the last year as you look to grow everything there at KPMG?
Yeah, no, it's been definitely an interesting year, and there has been a lot of change. I think one of the other main areas that I'm seeing quite a bit in the practice is around pay equity. So some of you may or may not be aware that Ontario and Quebec have pay equity legislation and require employers to do a pay equity exercise that sort of compares similar jobs in terms of gender to make sure that male and female employees doing jobs of equal value are paid similarly. But and then the federal government is releasing legislation next January to basically require federal employers to become pay equity compliant in a very similar way. It's interesting because Quebec and the federal government and Ontario all have different methods and standards. So you think they could have got together and got the same method, but they don't. And so that's going to be introduced as well. And I think it rolls well into I&D issues for employers, because that's actually a regulated requirement to do a pay equity exercise and ensure that there's equality from a gender perspective. But I think there's opportunity for employers to take that a step further and do the analysis from the BIPOC perspective. And so I think with there's been a lot of traction in my practice about policies and initiatives, sort of tracking recruitment numbers, sort of making sure that employers are I think a lot of companies are more aware of issues now. And so there's I think that plays into it nicely, where we kind of have the tools on the gender side. And so it could push into bigger things from that perspective.
Now, certainly in our legal profession, and glad you brought that up. We're looking at diversity there in terms of Black, Indigenous, people of color, women, people with disabilities. I mean, all the whole gamut there. And certainly there's been, I think, a lot of inroads from where we were 10, 15 years ago. But I mean, at
Right.
the same time, I mean, there's a lot more work that can be done. And so we were just talking about pay equity there. I mean, what have you seen kind of within our profession in terms of opportunities there for diversity and addressing sort of that glass ceiling that seems to be there for all of those disadvantaged groups? And are you seeing anything different from your time being partner at a couple big firms there to what you're doing now?
Right. Well, I do think that the legal profession has, become more aware of creating more diversity amongst the practice, not only amongst lawyers, but I think also paralegals as well and clerks, and maybe looking into how we can attract more people or make sure that we're providing equal opportunity for people to get the education they need to practice. And then it's about sort of how do you then transition that into allowing people to be successful, like what programs within companies and firms should be in place to help ensure that people are treated similarly and given similar opportunities to get on the good files and succeed in the practice the way it is, and perhaps even changing the way we define the practice and the way we define our productivity. I can certainly speak from a gender perspective. There's typically a lot, 50% plus females graduate law school, and they have since I left law school 15 years ago. But we're certainly not there at the higher equity partner level of females. So what's happening along the way? And does it relate to the way that we sort of the hours that we work, or like when are people leaving the profession? How does that? And I think it's a matter of looking at, and I do think there's been certainly a lot of strides in that respect. And the Law Society of Ontario has like sort of a gender project that sort of looking into firms and making sure that we're all aware of how women are succeeding in the practice from that perspective. And I think some of the things we've learned along that way can help expand into other diverse populations. I think for the paralegal profession, to me, it's a bit of a gem of a job in some way. Like I think that there's a lot of opportunity for paralegals, and and we're getting into firms, and not necessarily firms are starting your own practice. So I think that it's an interesting, and now there's been a lot over the last couple of years that now that you're regulated and you're, sort of have more, I think, better opportunities than you did before, is a great career and great, value add to the profession. And that should also be not only the focus on the lawyers and succeeding, but also in the paralegal profession. I think and it could offer a bit of flexibility that maybe some people are looking for that you may not get as a lawyer.
Now, for any paralegal students, law students, young lawyers, anyone listening, any women there, any advice that you have for kind of starting into the career there, and what you can look to in terms of achieving success in the legal profession?
Mm-hmm. I would say it's definitely it's a lot of work. Like this is certainly a profession that requires long hours, but at some point you move from being the worker and the researcher and the writer, and it and then you become the person who manages the client relationships, and then you get to mentor students, and you're mentoring associates, and you're working more in a more well-rounded way. And it's, all of those years of hard work, I think it ultimately becomes worth it. And it is a profession that I think offers a good amount of flexibility in terms of, you're accountable to your clients and your work and the firm. But if you need to leave in the middle of the day and, go for an appointment, or just, you have kind of that flexibility. Like it certainly feeds well from that perspective. I think though, one thing that's very key in this profession is your relationships. And never underestimate even the classmates that you meet in this, and what these connections can do for you later Certainly staying connected with people in law school has helped me because people go in different directions. And, people always told me that coming out early years is like these, your peers now will be your clients later on, or vice versa, if you go in a different direction. And that's very true. And at some point, they become the decision maker on who the work goes to and how that happens. And so just having a big network of people and staying connected, this is ultimately a service industry. We're a professional service, and we develop with our clients, and we get involved in their businesses very deeply, and it can be very rewarding that way. And I think having those personal connections makes it that much more enjoyable.
They just brought up there the long hours, and certainly even with COVID, obviously a new wrinkle there in terms of legal professionals and taking care of ourselves as well, right? In terms of our own mental health, and certainly probably comes up in the employee context as well, given everything that's happening and people fearful of losing work. I mean, is there any kind of advice or anything that's worked for you, especially over the last year, in terms of kind of making everything work and still having time for yourself and getting through this? I mean, just all the challenges that have come over the last 14 months, and even just generally in the legal profession,
Right.
the billable hours and things like that. It's very demanding.
It is very demanding. And I do think that there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of how we measure productivity. I don't think that it's always the right thing to have, sort of billable targets as a reflection of productivity or skill, for that matter. I think in some ways it breeds inefficiency, and that's not healthy for you, and it's not the best service that we can always offer to our clients. So that may be a different topic another day. However, it is long hours, and there's a lot going. There's a lot of different directions that pull you. I have 3 young kids, and this year in particular has been very challenging because they're all school age and they're at home, and there's a lot going on. I think I have a great support network within my firm. So when things happen, I know I have good partners that I can rely on to help. If I need to take the time, what typically worked for me, I like to run. I have something like as an outlet that I think you have to kind of work into your daily life. And it's always really easy to say, I don't have the time. So I'm somebody who tends to try and schedule throughout the week blocks of time that allow me to go and, run or do something physical that I can, get the excess energy out and keep my mind healthy and do that sort of thing. So I would say like that's an important, as much as you schedule a call with a client, you schedule time for yourself. I'm a believer in that. I think that really works.
Now, in addition, certainly to moving over here to KPMG over the last year, what has it been like? I mean, we've talked all about working from home and in sort of a general perspective, but in terms of practicing law, what have you noticed in terms of being in this environment that's different from being in person, and perhaps even comparing it to the firms that you were at to what you're doing now? How has this sort of transition been for you, and what sort of worked and what has been challenging? I mean, I know obviously you have 3 young children.
Life is challenging. But I would say for the practice, and I'm a litigator, so that's changed a lot. I'm sure you've heard also from other guest speakers, like we're, virtual court and we're in arbitrations virtually. I've done collective bargaining virtually, which is a whole different thing. I think initially, as we all transitioned, and our clients got Teams and we got on Zoom, we actually kind of saw each other more because, we just seeing each other on the screen. We normally would be on the phone. I don't know if you've tried to have a conference call on the phone lately. It's very odd. And so we sort of all did that. And I found like we're just sort of holding on to each other, like clients and colleagues included, which was nice. And it created a lot of bonds, and we sort of helped each other, especially with my clients where, you're dealing with new things like every day around all of the changes to legislation, the lockdown, health and safety issues. So we're kind of right there with them. So that was, I think, a really like rewarding part for the practice. I think what's challenging though is you kind of miss out on the fun stuff. like you're at a mediation, there's some downtime, you're talking to clients. Like now when people are in virtual mediations, they tend to kind of log off. I'm going to go check my email, right? Or you could have lunch, you could work luncheon, or maybe go for a drink after the hearing, or you meet a bit earlier, you have a prep session early. So there's a decent amount of travel in my practice. So I do miss that. I miss the seeing people and that social part of it. You're still working, but you get that social element, and it's a hard job to begin with. Like we deal with companies' problems, and often it's acrimonious, and we always have somebody on the other side. It can be very stressful for our clients. We're always dealing with sort of angst and anxiety around an issue, and so that can sort of wear on you over time. And what I've always found over the years is the clients that I have good relation, I can balance doing those social things and going for lunch, and you connect with them in a different way where you become friends. I think we're missing out on that without being able to be face to face now. So I just don't know how strong client relationships are going to be if we continue in a virtual world.
Now, with certainly as a litigator, there's probably been quite a lot of mediations. My evening students have mock mediations tonight. So any advice for them? I'm sure they want last minute advice there to do it on Zoom. Adds another wrinkle on top of that. I think the challenge certainly is you don't have as much control over your client because it's not like you can mute them or something, right? But what have you found in terms of doing some mediations and then even arbitrations as well there in the Zoom, Microsoft Teams kind of environment? What's worked and what's aside from having cat filters on and things like that,
right?
what hasn't worked for you in that transition?
Yeah, I think sometimes if my file is document heavy, it's a lot easier to have a brief with tabs. You show up, you're in person, you got your file, and you're showing you're sort of go to this tab and that sort of thing. So that is much more efficient and easier to walk through your evidence when you've got it bound in that way versus I have struggled virtually on transitioning to that. So if I'm sharing, sometimes you can't share your screen on Zoom because I'm not the presenter. So you're kind of, and especially in a hearing, it's really awkward to sort of be okay, I need you to go here in this tab. It gets to be hyper organized going in and know exactly where things are. And sometimes the numbers don't add up in the same way that maybe it would if you print it out and it's physical. So that can be logistically something that you really have to think through and plan for, because otherwise it interrupts the flow of either your argument or the position that you're doing for mediations. You can still do breakout rooms for mediation, you're in one room and they're in another room. I think sometimes clients find it a bit, I don't know if it's easier, but it's just a different experience if you are virtually with the other side. So you're not versus in the same room, right? When you're in the same room and you're across the table from the other side and you're sort of making your pitch or you're talking, it's a very different experience than if you're on a Zoom call and you just see their picture, right? And so I think that especially on the plaintiff side, I think there's probably less sort of cathartic energy that goes into mediations that you'd want for them, so that they can sort of feel like they got it out, they said what they needed to say, and then they're moving to the point of settlement. So I would that's a very important part of the mediation process, and I think we now miss that if we're virtual. So you have to sort of figure out how do you get it, and a good mediator will do that. They go to the other side, they hear the person, they spend a lot of time. So if you're and so as you're sitting there, you have to kind of expect and anticipate with your client that, okay, we're going to probably be, usually the company side is, we're not doing very much for a good hour and a half at the start of the day. And so that's also very different. What's worked is, it is still virtual, like we are still in meet, like we still can chit chat about things. Sharing your screen with your client can be really helpful, especially if you're working through some numbers and you're trying to figure out like what the costing of certain things are, and so how to break things down. I would usually typically have a screen in the room anyways and be able to break things down from that, because you always you need to know the math, mediation. You need to ultimately know what the money is at the end of the day, what matters.
Perfect. See, there's a couple questions from the students here about, I guess, going back to if you get COVID from work. And I know this is probably not really settled anywhere from our earlier discussion, but if it's definitively from work, are they going to be responsible for your like out-of-pocket expenses, or how would that all work?
Probably not. Like I said, I don't think we can say this is a WSIB thing. So I don't think we can get, coverage for loss. In my experience, most employers will pay for some if you don't have a benefit plan, then you could, they may still be prepared to deal, because if it's connected to the workplace, I think you could probably ask for help. I don't think there's a legal obligation to do that though. So in terms of, I don't know what expenses you would have, like maybe doctor's notes could be something, but I don't think you're going to have that.
Perfect. So thank you so much, Lisa, here for taking the time and joining us. Really enjoyed hearing all about working from home and all the employment related issues. And certainly it's been sort of a new frontier with employment and labor law. And it's probably going to be like that for the next 3 to 5 years as we kind of go through all of the backlog, and as well as the new things that'll come up once we're kind of transitioning back into whatever the new normal is going to be, and what's going to stick, what's going to change. And I was wondering if you have any final words of advice for my students here, especially anyone interested in getting into employment law. Certainly paralegals can take $35,000 or less matters in small claims court. Obviously, human rights is full at the tribunal, any issues there, but anything you can share with anyone hoping to enter into the profession. And once again, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah. No problem at all. I think employment law does lend itself well for the paralegal profession, and in terms of representing. Typically, I've seen that paralegals would often represent plaintiff side versus employer side work. But I also think there's opportunity on the consulting side, like occupational health and safety consulting, sort of disability management. I think that paralegal that works really well because they're very sort of document heavy. You've got good analytical skills. You can sort of sift through large documents. Same with even I wouldn't sort of put past the pay equity part of it. And so that there's often consultants in that. So I think those are all great areas that would suit the sort of the paralegal training really well.
Perfect. So all the best there, Lisa. Thanks to everyone for tuning in, and take care and stay safe, especially during these uncertain times. And I feel definitely, if you're interested in employment law, for anyone listening there, now's the time that there's so much that will be changing, and there's always going to be opportunities there in all of those different areas. So thanks again. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Sorry about that. It's just